In a blistering Senate showdown, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett goes head-to-head with former doctor turned Senator Rand Paul over insulin prices that have cost thousands of lives. He coldly defends a broken system, but Jasmine strikes back, unleashing damning evidence and reading the names of the dead, one by one, until the entire chamber falls silent. Cameras lock in, the nation holds its breath, and one brutal question rips through the room. When a doctor chooses profit over life, who saves the dying? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The Senate chamber felt like a freezer, but not because of the air conditioning. It was the kind of cold that came from tension so heavy it seemed like a weapon. In the gallery sat faces carved by grief and fatigue, a mother clutching the photo of her dead son, a nurse still in scrubs stained from last night's shift, a veteran with oxygen tubes taped under his nose. TV cameras clicked into position, circling like predators waiting to strike. The sign read, "Special hearing on prescription drug pricing, insulin and cancer medications." But everyone knew what it really meant. America was about to decide if the right to stay alive had a price tag. Outside, protesters lifted signs that screamed, $3 in Canada, $300 in the US, and Big Pharma kills quietly. Inside, no one spoke. The silence was suffocating, until the doors burst open and Senator Rand Paul entered, shoulders rigid, tie sharp, his face hard as stone. He walked like a man used to cutting into hearts and bending votes to his will. Once a doctor, now a libertarian warrior, Paul had become the polished shield of the pharmaceutical giants, wrapping their greed in the clean language of constitutional order. He took his seat, leaned into the mic with the slow calm of a surgeon raising a scalpel, and spoke before anyone else could. "Let me be absolutely clear," he said, voice flat and cold. "Healthcare is not a constitutional right. It is a commodity, like a car, a house, or a gym membership. If you want it, you pay for it." The words ripped through the room. Gasps rose. A woman in the back squeezed her inhaler like it was her last breath. A man 2 rows behind muttered, "He just put a price on life." Paul didn't blink. He wasn't there to comfort anyone. He was there to lock the story down. Then came the turn. A second door creaked open, not loud but heavy, like something fateful. Jasmine Crockett entered, fire wrapped in shadow. She wore a jet black suit, no makeup, only the steel flash in her eyes. She moved like someone who had already survived a war with the system and refused to burn again. In her hands was a thick dossier stuffed with colored tabs and red slashes of ink. Less a report, more a weapon. She didn't smile, didn't nod. She sat across from Paul and laid the folder on the table as if it carried the weight of 1,000 lives. The cameras swung instantly, locking on her like she was the center of gravity itself. The silence between Jasmine and Rand had just begun to settle when she slid her hand over the folder, flipped it open, and, without raising her voice, unleashed the first blow. There was no shouting, no pleading, no dramatic performance. What came out was heavier, sharper, a kind of quiet that didn't wait for approval. She glanced down once at her notes, then slowly lifted her eyes, not only at Senator Paul, but at everyone inside the chamber. Every head turned. Aides froze with pens in midair. Reporters stopped mid-keystroke, and even the C-SPAN cameraman instinctively zoomed closer. When Jasmine finally spoke, her words cracked through the room like a gavel striking wood. "I won't be speaking about policy today. I want to speak about a mother, Maria Gutierrez, 37 years old, Dallas, Texas." The name dropped into the room like stone into still water. One woman, one city, one age. But inside that short line was a flood of loss. Jasmine's voice stayed steady, each word heavy, as if she were reading from scripture. She worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices at night, cashiering at a gas station by day. She had no insurance. She rationed her insulin to feed her children. 3 weeks later, she was dead. A couple of senators shifted stiffly in their seats. Rand Paul looked down, face unreadable, but his fingers betrayed him, tapping against the table in a tense, nervous rhythm. The chamber didn't move, didn't breathe. It just sank into the weight of what had been said. Jasmine didn't add drama. She didn't need to. The cruelty was already laid bare. A woman doing everything right, working double shifts, keeping her family alive, was gone. Not because insulin didn't exist, but because someone decided her life wasn't worth the cost. Then came the moment that changed the air. Jasmine leaned forward, pressed a small remote, and the chamber lit up with a cold blue glow. The screen behind her flashed stark white letters on a black background. Brutal. Unforgiving. Cost to manufacture 1 vial of insulin, $3. The air seemed to lock in people's lungs. Another click. Average price charged to Americans, $340. The effect wasn't showmanship. It was instinct. Bodies recoiled like the numbers themselves had weight. A staffer in the back dropped her phone. A photographer lowered his camera, hands trembling. Somewhere in the silence, a whisper cut through. Jesus Christ. The contrast hit like a blunt force, too brutal to look away from. This wasn't theory, wasn't policy talk. It was raw, undeniable math. $3 to keep someone alive. $340 to keep investors smiling. Jasmine didn't flinch. Her hands rested flat on the desk, steady as stone. She didn't need to gesture toward the screen. The numbers glared louder than any speech. The equation itself was already the indictment, already the crime. She turned her head, slow and deliberate, locking her gaze on Rand Paul. Her eyes didn't blaze with anger. They didn't spark with outrage. They simply held him, unyielding, unwavering, like a weight he couldn't shake. And then, in a voice softer than a whisper, yet heavier than a hammer, she cut through the chamber. So I ask you, Dr. Paul, exactly how much is a life worth in this country? The question landed like a strike to the gut. The room froze. No shuffle of papers, no cough, no movement. Because everyone already knew the truth, and not one of them dared to say it aloud. For a moment, the chamber felt lifeless. Just the brutal math of injustice echoing in every corner. But Rand Paul was not the kind of man to sit in silence, especially when his creed was under siege. He leaned into the microphone like someone drawing a weapon, his movements precise, practiced, dangerous. His fingers adjusted the mic slowly, almost ritualistic. It wasn't about sound, it was about control. The same way a surgeon steadies his scalpel before the first cut. Only this wasn't surgery. This was combat, and his first strike was aimed squarely at the woman across from him. When his voice broke the silence, it was cold, sharp, honed by years of authority. "Let me respond," he said. This is exactly the kind of emotional grandstanding that twists serious debate." He never looked away from Jasmine. His stare was fixed, deliberate, dripping with contempt he didn't bother to mask. He had faced women like her before, lawyers, activists, reformers, and every time, his mission was the same: strip them of their moral high ground. Representative Crockett isn't here to discuss real solutions. She's here to weaponize sympathy. The room tightened. A man in the second row shifted as if the floor itself had tilted beneath him. But Rand pressed on, voice steady, icy, unyielding. "What she won't tell you is that in countries like Canada, where government healthcare rules, people wait 6 months just for a diagnosis. They wait to die." He paused, not for theater, but because he believed it with the confidence of someone who had never stood in line for anything in his life. Then, lifting his chin with quiet arrogance, he reached for his dagger of proof. The story meant to crown him with authority. "I've performed surgeries on patients who fled those systems, patients their governments abandoned. I know what it means when the state decides who gets to live." The silence that followed was different from the one Jasmine had created earlier. This wasn't the silence of shared grief or moral awakening. This was heavier, colder, a pause manufactured to sound like reason, but lined with calculation. The kind of stillness that suggested fairness was negotiable, that suffering had to be measured to matter. Rand's voice dropped lower, carrying more weight as he shifted from attacking Jasmine to preaching his creed. He no longer spoke to the people in front of him, but to the ideology embedded in the marble and steel of the Capitol itself. "Healthcare," he said, steady and unyielding, "is not a right, it is a product. And products, whether houses, cars, or clean suits, are not given away. They're earned." The words landed like a judge's hammer, shutting the door on empathy. And just when it seemed he had drained his arsenal of lofty arguments, Rand Paul unveiled something more unsettling, a smile. It was the wrong smile for the moment. Subtle, sharp, curling at the corner of his lips. Not pride, not relief. It was condescension. The grin of a man convinced he had scored his point, even if it meant trampling human dignity to do it. He leaned back in his chair, not to ease himself, but to watch, like a man observing an opponent's collapse in a battle he would never have to fight himself. His fingertips tapped lightly on the polished wood before him, steady and controlled, every beat deliberate. Then he spoke again, his tone low, assured, the kind of voice meant to slice through emotion with the edge of arithmetic. "You talk about saving lives," he said, pacing each word like a lecture instead of a hearing. "But let's look at the math." He gestured upward with ease, as if the crushing weight of the healthcare system were nothing more than numbers hovering in the air. His tone carried no sorrow, no urgency, just cold calculation. "Do you know what happens to federal spending when you promise everything to everyone?" There was no dramatic pause. He didn't need one. To him, the conclusion was obvious. We collapse. The economy breaks. The debt detonates. And we become a nation where scarcity suffocates innovation. And I know exactly what that looks like. His words sliced through the chamber with cold precision, each one landing like a scalpel without anesthesia. No space was left for the mother who died rationing insulin. No space for the boy forced to miss chemo because his parents couldn't cover the deductible. To Rand Paul, those weren't horrors. They were footnotes, regrettable, yes, but necessary sacrifices to keep the machinery of free market ideology running smoothly. He wasn't just defending a belief system. He was lifting it above human suffering, placing it on a pedestal untouched by pain. And with one last twist of the blade, he delivered his final verdict. Not as a warning, but as a dismissal. "You want to turn America into a second-rate version of Venezuela." That line wasn't meant to spark discussion. It was meant to end it. A single word packed with fear, collapse, and the specter of failed governments. Venezuela, the one-size-fits-all scare tactic, thrown out like a grenade to blow up nuance. He didn't bother to explain it. He didn't have to. The word came loaded. Breadlines, black markets, hospitals with empty shelves. Rand said it like someone who'd never stood in line for insulin, never sat beside a dying relative with no insurance, but who had read just enough headlines to use other people's misery as a weapon. He looked directly at Jasmine, waiting for her to blink, to recoil, but she didn't move. She held steady, back straight, jaw clenched, not from anger, but from discipline, because she knew something he didn't. For millions of Americans, the nightmare he spoke of wasn't some foreign warning. It was already here. No need to invoke another country. No need to imagine collapse. It had already arrived, quietly and efficiently through laws, loopholes, and invoices. Rand Paul sat there smiling behind numbers, but Jasmine Crockett sat behind names, behind Maria Gutierrez, behind every family that couldn't afford to stay alive, behind every uninsured soul erased by someone else's bottom line. The real question wasn't whether America was turning into Venezuela. It was, how long would it keep pretending it hadn't already become something worse? She didn't get up. She didn't have to. The stench of Rand Paul's Venezuela remark still hung in the air, like smoke after a detonation. So Jasmine calmly struck her own match and tossed it into the kindling. She picked up the remote with the kind of care people use when handling explosives. Not because it might go off, but because it already had. One click. The lights in the chamber dimmed just enough to signal something serious. The big screen behind her lit up. Jasmine didn't even glance at it. Her eyes stayed forward, locked in, like she wasn't showing slides but putting the soul of the country on trial. The first image was simple but lethal. A bar graph. 3 red pillars towering over the screen, each labeled with the name of a pharmaceutical giant. Eliwell, Novamira, Trionex. Beneath them, numbers that looked less like earnings and more like body counts. Together, they'd raked in $47.3 billion in 1 year, most of it off the backs of desperate patients needing insulin and cancer meds. Under the lights, the bars didn't just glow red. They throbbed, like veins carrying blood money. Click. The graph vanished. In its place, a corporate document, clean, precise, labeled in bold at the top, confidential Q3 pricing strategy, insulin. Jasmine had highlighted a line in neon yellow as if daring anyone to pretend they hadn't seen it. The American market remains elastic. Push price plus 18%. Pain threshold not yet visible. It didn't hit the room. It suffocated it. The word elastic might have sounded harmless to a hedge fund manager, but to anyone who'd watched someone ration insulin, it was monstrous. This wasn't about medicine. It was about pressure points. Suffering wasn't an accident. It was a variable, a calculation. Pain threshold wasn't coming from a hospital chart. It came from a profit memo. And Jasmine let it sit there, ugly, exposed, and rotting in the open. People started to shift. One elderly woman in the gallery, a retired nurse, gray hair tucked under a church hat, lifted her hand to her mouth and whispered something no one could hear. A journalist froze mid-keystroke. Even Rand Paul, who moments ago had spoken with a smirk welded to his face, sat still. And that smirk? Gone. Like someone had cut the cord. Then came the third slide. Not a graph. Not a memo. A video. The footage was grainy, handheld, clearly taken on someone's phone. Time-stamped. Inside a polished boardroom, brightly lit, a dozen executives sat around a long table. Standing at the front, coffee in hand, suit perfectly tailored, was the CEO of Trionex, a man whose name was etched into campaign finance records and business magazine covers. And he was smiling, composed, relaxed, like nothing in the world could touch him. "If we don't raise drug prices, our shareholders will sue us," he said, like he was talking about moving a lunch meeting. No shame, no fear, just business as usual. The executives didn't gasp. They nodded. A few chuckled. It wasn't panic. It was routine. The voice of someone who'd never stood in a Walgreens watching a child cry because their parent couldn't afford a refill. The video ended. The screen went black. And that's when Jasmine finally spoke. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The room had already stopped breathing. "You talk about markets, about collapse, about fear, but you won't talk about what's already breaking down right in front of you. Dignity, compassion, the bare minimum we should owe each other." Her words didn't fly. They dropped. Heavy, precise, like doses of insulin being cut into thirds because someone can't afford a full shot. "If we don't raise drug prices, our shareholders will sue us," she repeated slower now. "Not if we don't save lives, not if we don't heal people, just if we don't make more money." Then for the first time since the video ended, she turned and looked straight at Rand Paul. There was no fire in her eyes, just truth. "Tell me, Senator, when did we decide that saving someone's life had to pass a profitability test? When did that become normal?" Nobody answered. There was only the soft hum of overhead lights and the quiet tick of cameras capturing what would soon be the most gut-punching moment in the national conversation on healthcare. Jasmine's fingers rested on the folder beside her, no longer clenched. She wasn't holding back anymore. She'd already ripped the curtain wide open, and what stood behind it wasn't an economic emergency. It was a moral crime. She looked out again, at the veteran breathing through an oxygen tube, the mother clutching her purse like it held her life, the young woman in the back row, wiping silent tears from her face. Jasmine saw it clearly. This wasn't just about insulin. This was about what kind of cruelty a country is willing to excuse when it hides behind numbers. Because in a nation where a CEO can joke about getting sued for not charging enough, and a mother can die over a $300 vial of medicine, the issue isn't just greed. The real issue is that greed has been normalized, and grief has been turned into a private, quiet transaction. The room was still reeling from what Jasmine had just revealed when Rand Paul leaned back in his chair, spine straightening, eyes narrowing, not with reflection, but with retreat. He couldn't disprove the facts, so he did what men like him always do when cornered. He aimed at the woman who delivered them. His voice cut through the tension like a slow blade. Not angry, worse, controlled, chilly. He leaned forward, planting his elbows on the table like a tenured professor, too bored to keep pretending his students had something worthwhile to say. His fingers pressed together under his chin, just for a beat, then dropped softly onto the table. One tap, deliberate, like a judge about to issue a ruling no one could appeal. "You don't understand," he said. He let those three words hang in the air, heavy with implication. This wasn't disagreement. It was dismissal, condescension wrapped in a silk tie. He turned his head toward Jasmine, wearing the expression of someone about to correct a first-year intern in front of the entire floor. "You're a lawyer, not a doctor." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was meant to puncture, not explode. A clean, calculated dig meant to peel away her credibility, to shrink everything she had just said into a footnote. Rand dropped his voice a notch lower, almost confidential, like he was letting her in on something the rest of the room was too naive to grasp. "You're reading scripts," he said, tone lined with boredom. "You don't understand the science. You don't understand the economics. You're performing, acting out some righteous scene written by activists, powered by outrage." He let out a small sigh, a shake of the head, the practiced sadness of someone pretending he expected better. Then, with perfect timing, he turned, just slightly, toward the cameras. "This isn't analysis, it's moral theater, a performance. And honestly," he added, voice curling at the edge, "I've seen better actors." No one moved, no one clapped. The silence that followed wasn't reverent. It was sickening. What Rand Paul didn't realize, what he never seemed to learn, was the weight of the moment right before a storm hits. Jasmine didn't react. Not right away. Her hands stayed folded. Her body didn't shift. But her eyes dipped down for just a breath. Not out of shame, not out of hesitation. It was calculation. Quiet. Controlled. The kind of stillness only someone used to being underestimated could hold without flinching. Her shoulders didn't rise, her face didn't twist. But there was something in the way she breathed, one pause, one small tightening in her chest, that said she'd heard all of this before. Too many times. Then she looked up. The camera caught it clean. Her face calm, but weighted. Brow drawn not by anger, but by something deeper. Her lips parted, just barely. No drama. No pause for effect. Because what she was about to say didn't need stagecraft. It had gravity of its own. She drew in a breath and said, "If understanding medicine means justifying its price," each word came slow, unrushed, clean. "If wearing a white coat means standing by while people die," not a sound in the chamber, "then I'll gladly remain an outsider." No crescendo, no catchphrase, just the truth. Delivered straight, like a verdict. This wasn't a rebuttal, it was a reclamation. Jasmine wasn't trying to defend her role anymore. She was rewriting the rules of the conversation. Rand had tried to reduce her to a title, a resume line, an interloper in a debate too complex for her. But she answered with the one thing no degree could grant: moral clarity. And something shifted. Not loud, not obvious, but deep. The kind of shift that lingers after the lights go out. In that instant, the power balance tipped, not because she shouted over him, but because she refused to shrink for him. Rand Paul had offered hierarchy. Jasmine Crockett gave them humanity. He wrapped his argument in credentials and cold logic. She stripped it bare, and underneath showed the bruises. And in that still, fluorescent-lit chamber, transformed into a battleground and broadcast into millions of homes, something incredible happened. A black woman, soft-spoken but unshaken, backed only by documents and names of the dead, turned one of the Senate's loudest voices into background noise, and she didn't need to raise her voice to do it. They had tried to shrink her down to a job title, a script, a political inconvenience. But Jasmine Crockett didn't come to debate. She came to break the silence, with names. Slowly, she reached under the desk. No sudden moves, just the kind of quiet, deliberate care someone might use to retrieve a folded flag at a soldier's funeral. Her fingers brushed something thick, rough paper, brown, heavy, neatly creased into thirds. It made the softest rustle as she pulled it out. But in a room this still, it sounded like thunder cracking through concrete. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. Just the sight of it said more than words ever could. This wasn't theater. This was Judgment Day. She laid the paper down in front of her. No rush. Her hands moved with calm control. First fold, then the second, and then the last. When it was fully open, the sheet stretched wide across her desk like a banner made of grief. Row after row of names, printed in dense black ink. No images, no colors, no distractions. Just names, ages, cities, dates. That was it. Cold, brutal, unflinching. At first, people leaned forward, curious, cautious. But then it hit, like a shift in pressure no one saw coming. This wasn't data. This wasn't a spreadsheet or a speech. This was a list of the dead. Jasmine stared at the first column. She didn't look up, didn't say a word. She was bracing herself, not performing. This moment didn't call for drama. It called for something harder, courage. And then, in the same even voice she'd used all day, she began to read. Carlos Ramirez, 52nd San Antonio. One name. Clean. Director. Ayanna Fields, 28th. Lubbock. A breath. Jacob Nguyen, Ondokuzunchu, Houston. A heartbeat. Margaret Holloway, Altmansi Kumand, Nelius El Paso Stillness. Benjamin T. Morris, Yolku Otuz, Yedinja Dallas. The room didn't twitch, didn't swallow. For 45 seconds straight, Jasmine read, name after name. No commentary, no pause for applause. Just a steady stream of loss. Her voice, which had cross-examined senators and dismantled policy arguments just hours earlier, was now offering eulogies. Not for one person, but for hundreds. Her tone never wavered. There was no tremor. Because this wasn't about emotion, it was about duty. The duty to say their names, to pull them out of statistics and put them back in the light. By the 10th name, the energy in the chamber cracked. In the back row, an aide dropped her pen. She didn't even bother picking it up. A reporter froze over his keyboard, hands hovering like the next word might never come. A mother clutching a photo of her son brought her hand to her mouth. She wasn't crying, not yet, but the way she gripped that frame like it might disappear said everything. Still, Jasmine read, Levi Grant, Trixati Triti Plano, Inez Morales, Kirk Birinci Austin, Tobias Kendrick, Altmazatodik Galveston, Naomi Washington, Yermi Uchunja Waco, Elias Kim, 38 Arlington. Each name hit like a hammer, not loud, just relentless. A reminder that this wasn't some policy theory. This was real, already decided, already buried. And the thing that decided it? Profit. When she stopped reading, it wasn't sudden. It was intentional, like turning the last page of a story that never should have ended this way. She placed her fingertips on the edge of the list, right between two names. Her hand was steady, her eyes lifted, not to Rand Paul, not even just to the senators, but to the entire room. She looked at the marble, the leather seats, the flags. She looked like she didn't belong, but only because truth always looks out of place in buildings built to hide it. Then she spoke. That's just a fraction. From one state, in 1 year, in a country that calls itself free. She didn't raise her voice, but the weight of what she said dropped like iron. No slogans, no graphs, no ideology, just the truth. Texas. 1 year, 2,412 names, each one a scar. The room didn't move, but something inside it did, deep down, in its core. Even the camera stopped searching for angles. No slow zooms, no cuts, just a frozen frame. Because when the truth hits this hard, even the lens has to hold its breath. The list stayed spread out before her. Still, heavy, more real than any speech in the building. Jasmine didn't end with a closing line. She didn't need to. There was nothing left to say. She let the silence return. Not the usual kind, the empty, dismissive kind. This was something else. The silence of reckoning. And in that silence, even the most powerful people in the room had no choice left. They had to listen. The names of the dead were still hanging in the air, like a funeral procession that refused to fade. But Jasmine wasn't done. Not yet. If the room had just seen who paid the price, now it was time to reveal who profited off every silent grave. She turned slowly toward the screen again, her hand calm but certain on the remote. The brown craft paper still lay stretched across her desk like a battlefield. Each name a fallen soldier in a war most Americans didn't know they were fighting. But the next blow Jasmine was about to land wasn't about the lives lost. It was about the comfort bought with their deaths. One click. The screen blinked awake. No more names. Just numbers. Numbers so cold they could chill bone. Pharmaceutical Industry Contributions to Senator Rand Paul, 2013 to 2023. The title was plain, clean, almost clinical. But what followed beneath it hit like a steel beam. A bar graph, pristine and corporate, filled the screen. Pfizer, Eli Well, Trionex, Novomira. Logos, Americans had seen more than their own doctors. Each company's donations rose year by year, line by line, climbing like profits, not policy. The final figure stood boxed in blood red at the bottom. $4,300,000. The room went still again, but not like before. This wasn't grief. This was realization. An awful collective click in everyone's minds. Staffers, senators, reporters, everyone watching from home, from newsrooms, from hospital waiting rooms, all doing the math they didn't want to believe. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't have to. That number said everything. It wasn't just a figure, it was a cause of death. And the cause wasn't just insulin. It was the people who sold their votes to protect it. And right there, in bold, at the center of it all, Rand Paul. Jasmine let it linger, like a prosecutor who knows exactly when to stop talking so the evidence can do the damage for her. She didn't turn to look at him. She turned instead to the wall behind him, just slightly. Another click. The graph vanished. And what came next was raw. A shaky smartphone video took over the screen. Low resolution, bad angle, but real. And real was all it needed to be. The lighting flickered. The camera trembled. The setting, a closed-door healthcare summit in D.C., one the public wasn't supposed to see. But someone inside had filmed it anyway. Someone whose conscience had finally spoken louder than their fear. And there he was, Rand Paul, standing at a podium, navy suit, red tie, confident hands. The executives behind him sat like a boardroom choir, nodding along like they already knew the script. His voice was steady, familiar, rehearsed. We need to protect the freedom to price pharmaceuticals. He didn't rush it. He took his time, said it like gospel, not a ripple of pushback in the room, just mild applause, quiet laughter, as if he had just read off the lunch menu. No challenge, no shame, just a man delivering exactly what they'd paid to hear. Freedom, but not the kind that saves lives, the kind that charges $300 for what costs $3 to make. The clip ended suddenly. The screen froze on Rand's face, mouth mid-sentence, eyes locked, the words still stamped below. We need to protect the freedom to price pharmaceuticals. That still frame said more than any full video could. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't turn to the committee. She didn't call for order, because order was already gone. The silence had returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't respectful, it was haunted. She stared at the screen the way someone might stare at rot they've smelled for years but are only now seeing up close. And then she turned, deliberate, calm. Her voice didn't rise, but it cut deeper than ever. You can talk about freedom, she said, her tone icy and exact. But how much freedom is left when a doctor works for the drug dealers? It didn't echo. It exploded. No movement, no rustling of papers, no whispered rebuttals, just stillness, so complete it felt like the air had vanished. The press froze. Aides stopped writing. Senators stared ahead like statues. And Rand Paul? He sat motionless, his face unreadable. But his silence was screaming. His posture tried to say control. But everything else, his eyes, his stillness, the fact he didn't even reach for the mic, admitted the truth. He'd been exposed. This wasn't a zinger. It wasn't for the cameras. It was a strike through the core of everything he had built. A question so sharp it made every fancy suit in the room suddenly feel cheap. A doctor works for the drug dealers. Not a metaphor, not hyperbole, just the plain, brutal, legal reality. And everyone watching, inside the chamber, on live streams at kitchen tables, knew it. No one in the room thought she'd take it that far. But Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to play politics. She came to cut it open and show what was rotting inside. She spoke with the kind of clarity that only comes from watching policy destroy lives in real time. When the words of Washington show up as denial letters in your mailbox. When they lead to funerals paid for with GoFundMe links. When freedom means choosing between insulin and rent. The screen behind her remained frozen on the final frame. Rand Paul mid-sentence, surrounded by executives clapping like he delivered scripture. She didn't move, didn't hit the remote, didn't change the slide. She didn't need to. That one still image did what hours of hearings never could. It told the whole damn story. Because when a man defends the freedom to sell a $3 vial for $340 and collects $4.3 million in donations to keep doing it, what other word is there? Who else but the desperate would call that freedom? Who else but the privileged would defend that decision? Jasmine took a step back from the screen, but she didn't step away from the moment. It clung to her like gravity, as heavy as the list of names still lying open in front of her. She didn't try to soften the blow, didn't pivot, didn't elaborate. She just stood there, right in the eye of the storm she had created. And this time, nobody interrupted. Not the senators, not the aides, not even Rand Paul. Because when the truth is that sharp, that undeniable, and backed by that much evidence, there's nothing left to argue. Only silence remains. The room had seen it all. Every number, every document, every damning frame of video. But what Jasmine Crockett said last cut deeper than any exhibit ever could. And Rand Paul, boxed in by the weight of truth, did what power so often does when cornered. He snapped. He jumped to his feet so fast it felt like the room itself had insulted him. The screech of his chair scraping against the marble floor tore through the silence like a gunshot. Some heads turned on instinct. Others locked forward, bracing themselves for what they knew was coming. His stance was stiff, not with dignity, but with barely contained rage. His chest puffed out, his knuckles white against the desk, like he was trying to keep something down. Maybe it was his temper. Maybe it was the truth unraveling around him. When he spoke, it wasn't just loud. It was loaded, laced with the kind of fury that comes from always being the one listened to, the one obeyed. I have dedicated my entire life to medicine. It burst from his mouth like a defense he'd rehearsed for years, desperate to protect his title, his legacy, his sense of self. He wasn't talking to Jasmine. He was talking to the cameras, to the donors, to the people back home who still thought a white coat made someone untouchable. He didn't pause. You have no right, no standing, to lecture me on morality. His voice cracked just slightly on right, splitting through the surface like a hairline fracture, exposing something raw underneath. This wasn't about policy anymore. This was personal. The anger wasn't over what she said. It was because she'd said it and backed it up. His donations, his record, his words on tape. And worst of all, the one person who had dragged it all out into the light wasn't an equal in his eyes. She was a black woman, a lawyer, a freshman. His hand rose, a trembling finger stabbing the air like a weapon. His entire body shook, not with righteousness but with collapse. Jasmine hadn't debated him. She had dismantled him, brick by brick, but she didn't budge. She stayed seated, still, steady, unmoved. While Rand towered above, shouting into the void, she sat like something ancient, something permanent. She didn't meet his fire with fire. She didn't even blink. She just waited. Let him pour it all out until he was empty. And when the room was quiet again, burned out and breathless, she looked up. Not with anger, not with scorn, just with clarity. Her voice came low, measured, razor sharp. I'm not lecturing on morality, she said. Each word landed like a blade on stone. I'm asking one question. Who saves the patient when the doctor chooses stocks over survival? There was no flair, no pitch, just pure gravity. She didn't need to punch. It dropped. And in dropping, it shattered everything that had held the room together. The silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was final. Rand Paul was still standing, But somehow he looked smaller, not in size, but in presence. In that instant, something in the room shifted. Everyone saw it, whether they admitted it or not. The mental image was already forming. A doctor skimming through stock charts while a single mom begs the pharmacist to sell her half a dose. A senator signing off on donations from companies that literally calculate who gets chemo based on quarterly margins. The camera panned across the room, slow and unblinking. A junior senator gripped her pen like it might snap. A journalist dropped his eyes from his notes and just stared at the floor. A staffer blinked hard, trying to swallow whatever just rose in their throat. Even the ever-whispering aides had gone dead quiet. The whole place, this hearing, this courtroom, this stage for the nation, froze. No one came to Rand's defense, not because they didn't have the words, but because Jasmine's question left them nowhere to run. It wasn't political, it wasn't personal, it was moral. And moral clarity doesn't leave room for rebuttals. Her hands stayed folded, the list of the dead still unfurled across the desk. The screen behind her still paused on Rand's face mid-quote. She didn't glance back at him. She didn't need to, because the moment wasn't between her and Rand anymore. It was between the country and its reflection. That question, it didn't belong to him alone. It belonged to every official who let a kid die because insulin was too expensive. Every executive who okayed a price spike to boost a quarterly earnings call. Every voter who clung to free market like it meant freedom from guilt. And every silent witness who stayed quiet in rooms like this until the numbers were too big and the names were too many. Who saves the patient when the doctor chooses stocks over survival? The question didn't echo. It lingered. It choked. It held. And it didn't need an answer. Because in that instant, the silence was the answer. And it was louder than any scream. Under the sterile glare of Capitol lights, Jasmine Crockett had asked a question no one wanted to face. Who saves the patient when the doctor chooses stocks over survival? The silence that followed wasn't emptiness. It was ignition. Not the end of a moment, but the spark of a movement. The echoes of her voice, sharp and unshaken, left that room and cracked across the country like thunder rolling over dry land. And when it hit, when her words landed in living rooms, waiting rooms, dorm rooms, and break rooms, it didn't just stir conversation, it broke the dam. People didn't just react, they erupted. Letters began flooding in, not the kind carefully crafted by lobbyists or staffers, but raw, trembling confessions written on the backs of utility bills and prescription pads. From West Virginia to Oakland, from border towns in Texas to the icy backroads of Minnesota, the unheard were finally speaking. A grandmother in Mississippi wrote in perfect cursive on yellowed stationery, "My husband died waiting for a procedure our insurance wouldn't approve. They sent the denial on a Tuesday. He died Thursday." A father from New Jersey, in scrawled block letters, said, "My daughter skipped chemo for 3 months because I couldn't cover the copay. When I heard that woman ask your question, I pulled over and cried in my truck." These weren't op-eds. They were evidence. The kind courts don't accept, but history never forgets. And it didn't stop there. Jasmine's words reached the medical world like a gut punch wrapped in truth. A young doctor in Ohio, just 2 years out of residency, posted an open letter that would be read aloud in over 100 hospitals by week's end. "I became a doctor to save lives, but this system makes me calculate cost before I can make a decision." What Jasmine said in that room reminded me, medicine isn't supposed to come with a price tag. The letter spread like fire through group chats, ER lounges, Reddit threads, and union email lists. It was printed and pinned to clinic bulletin boards, slipped under administrators' doors, shared during shift change briefings. Interns whispered it like gospel. Attending physicians, some with graying temples and heavy hearts, nodded along in silence. No one argued, because the system had always demanded quiet calculation. Jasmine had turned it into a question, and no one could answer without shame. The academy wasn't spared either. In lecture halls across the country, something extraordinary happened. Professors, some tenured, some just out of fellowships, paused their planned lectures and hit play on the hearing video. In ethics classes at Yale, Stanford, Michigan, and Howard, Jasmine's face filled the projection screen. The room would go silent as she asked, "What is freedom? if a patient has to die to protect a stock price. That sentence, said without a raised voice, was now showing up in final exams, paper titles, and whiteboard debates. A student at Tulane's med school asked a question during office hours. If I take the Hippocratic Oath but stay silent while people die from price gouging, did I ever take it at all? Another, at NYU Law, said simply, this isn't just healthcare. This is what happens when we let capitalism put on a white coat. What began as a congressional hearing had turned into a national syllabus, and Jasmine, without meaning to, had become its author. But it wasn't just campuses and clinics. In places often left off maps, small towns with one pharmacy or none, places where the hospital closed 5 years ago and never came back, people who hadn't voted in years were standing up at local town halls with folded printouts in their hands. They didn't quote economists, they quoted Jasmine. A single mother in rural Alabama, during a city council meeting, gripped the podium so hard her knuckles turned white. She held a faded photo of her teenage son and said, "If I can't afford to live, am I even counted as alive?" The room, mostly quiet for years, went still. No one interrupted her. No one dismissed her. Because her voice, like so many others, was no longer a whisper. It had been given permission to rise. Rand Paul's name was now showing up on posters, not in celebration, but in confrontation. In Louisville, a protester held up a sign outside a campaign fundraiser that read, "4.3 million won't buy your soul back." In Detroit, a mural appeared overnight. On it, Jasmine Crockett's face beside the names of 50 insulin victims from Michigan alone. Spray-painted beneath it, "Say our names louder than their donations." The hearing wasn't just a story anymore. It had become a scoreboard, and the public was keeping track. News anchors, ones who'd once rushed to cover DC like it was Hollywood for wonks, changed their tone. No more both sides. No more chuckling at political zingers. The tone shifted. The clip of Jasmine asking, "Who saves the patient when the doctor chooses stocks over survival?" became a recurring closing segment. One anchor on primetime paused after playing it and said, "This is not about right or left. This is about whether this country still remembers what human life is worth." That segment alone was watched by over 11 million people. In local newsrooms, journalists who had long begged editors to cover insulin stories were finally getting green lights. Obituaries of young diabetics became front-page features. A Texas paper ran a 2-page spread with 47 photos under the headline, "Gone before the check cleared." And beneath each photo was a short, brutal line, "Cause of death, age, the price of the last prescription they couldn't afford." Hospitals began reporting record spikes in walk-in donations. "In honor of Jasmine's hearing," read the note on one $100 bill left at a children's clinic in Ohio. Nurses cried, opening envelopes filled with $5 bills and handwritten notes. "This isn't much, but it's something. Thank you for fighting." And amid all this, every tweet, every segment, every story, Jasmine never changed course. She didn't tweet victory. She didn't do interviews packed with sound bites. She stayed quiet. Let the movement speak. Let the country absorb what it had seen. Because what she had offered wasn't a speech. It was a mirror. And the reflection it showed was no longer just about policy. It was about soul. By the end of the week, the hearing was no longer something you watched. It was something you carried. In your pocket, in your chest, in your conscience. Jasmine Crockett had walked into that chamber with a folder, a list of names, and a question. She walked out with a nation ready to listen. And for the first time in years, the silence that followed Washington wasn't apathy. It was awakening. And when the noise faded, Jasmine didn't retreat. She advanced. She didn't bask in the moment. She didn't ride the wave of viral applause or give the usual round of post-hearing interviews. Instead, she walked out of the Capitol, past the cameras, past the flashbulbs, and went straight to work. Within 24 hours, she returned not with rhetoric, but with a weapon, legislation. The Insulin for All Act dropped like a hammer. Its language was direct. No price could exceed $35 per vial, no exceptions, no backdoor deals for pharma, no vague timelines. The bill was a line in the sand drawn in ink, not blood, for once. It was clear, furious policy. And Jasmine wasn't asking for support. She was daring the system to say no, to her face in front of the country after everything it had just seen. But Jasmine knew laws don't always wake people up. Movements do. So while pundits debated the bill on cable news, she did something unexpected. She launched a community campaign, a grassroots storm she called the Right to Live Tour. No glossy ads, no staged rallies. This wasn't performative politics. It was real people, real rooms, and real reckoning. She didn't host them in D.C. She took them straight to where the pain lived. Hospitals that had lost funding, schools where nurses rationed bandages, towns where entire families shared one inhaler. At a hospital in Phoenix, she stood in the middle of a packed cafeteria, no mic, no stage, just her voice and a list of names on the table. She asked, "How many of you have skipped medication to pay a bill?" Nearly every hand went up. In a Dallas gym, she sat on a metal folding chair, knees to her chest, listening to a 13-year-old boy explain how his mom had split her insulin dose in half to make it last. In Baltimore, she shared a folding table with a retired ER nurse, a third-year med student, and a cancer survivor. No one talked like politicians. They talked like survivors, like witnesses, like people who knew what it meant to fight for every breath. She didn't lecture. She listened. But everywhere she went, the same question kept coming back. Not from reporters, but from janitors, cafeteria workers, volunteers. Is this really going to change anything? Jasmine didn't promise miracles. She didn't sell hope wrapped in buzzwords. She just told the truth. Not unless we all speak louder than money ever has. Then came the moment that rewrote the national mood. The National Conference on Medical Ethics wasn't known for drama. It was where doctors, hospital boards, and scholars discussed ethics with quiet tones and bottled water. But this year, Jasmine had been invited to close the event. Some expected a polite thank you speech. A few even rolled their eyes at the idea of a congresswoman addressing a room full of surgeons and scholars. Then she stepped up, alone. No podium, no slides, just presence. She paused long enough that people started to shift in their chairs. Then she said it. "We can't measure civilization by GDP. We measure it by how we treat the weakest among us." You could hear hearts stop. The sentence didn't rise. It settled, landed, stayed. One of the top oncologists in the room dropped his pen. A dean from Columbia muttered, "Damn." And then, like someone had flipped a switch, the entire hall rose. Not one or two. Everyone. They didn't clap because she won a debate. They clapped because she reminded them who they were supposed to be. For a moment, they weren't doctors or policymakers or academics. They were just people remembering their job was to protect life, not manage cost. The clip of that moment didn't just go viral. It became a cultural pivot. It played on MSNBC next to war coverage. It was shared on TikTok by nurses dancing in scrubs. It was quoted by pastors, by podcasters, by protesters standing in front of clinics. One journalist wrote, "Jasmine didn't give a speech. She held up a moral mirror, and we're all staring at it now." It wasn't just media noise. Something was shifting. In state legislatures from Illinois to Nevada, lawmakers began quoting her in floor debates. One even slammed a pharmaceutical rep's testimony by playing the clip and saying, "Explain your price hike in the context of this." Medical students began using it in their ethics courses. Hospital boards pinned it next to the code of conduct. And people who had never marched in their lives were suddenly printing it on signs, taping it to their car windows, holding it outside insurance headquarters. But Jasmine wasn't finished, not until she delivered the final line. It came at the end of a forum in Atlanta. The crowd was tired. Some were crying. Others just sat in stunned silence after hearing testimonies of families bankrupt from cancer meds, children whose funerals had cost more than their entire medical coverage. Jasmine didn't shout. She just stood there, looked at them and said, "We cannot call ourselves free if we let the sick die in silence. True freedom begins when every person has the right to live." It was the kind of line no one dared follow, the kind of truth no one edits. That sentence made its way onto banners overnight. In New York, it lit up the side of a building during a vigil. In Denver, it was projected across a hospital parking lot. In Flint, a fourth-grade teacher had her students write it on posters during a health awareness project. It showed up on t-shirts, church bulletins, protest flags, and most of all, it showed up in intent, in urgency. People stopped waiting for change. They started demanding it. Doctors began refusing speaker fees from pharmaceutical companies. School nurses contacted Congress en masse. Churches began hosting open clinics and inviting Jasmine to speak not as a politician, but as someone who made them remember what freedom actually costs. The quote didn't fade. It crystallized. We cannot call ourselves free if we let the sick die in silence. True freedom begins when every person has the right to live. It wasn't just a motto, it was a manifesto. And Jasmine, she didn't trademark it. She didn't sell it on merch. She gave it to the people. Because it was never about her, it was about what we do next. And the country, still stunned from a single voice in a Senate chamber, was finally ready to answer. And yet after the hearings, after the lists, after the silence, something bigger remained, the lesson. What Jasmine Crockett ignited wasn't just outrage, it was awakening. For decades, Americans had been told that healthcare was a privilege, that survival was a market choice, that death from lack of money was unfortunate, but not preventable. Jasmine didn't argue against that lie with spreadsheets or staged outrage. She took it by the throat and dragged it into the light. And once the truth was exposed, how we treat the sick, the poor, the voiceless, no one could unsee it. The real story wasn't just about insulin. It wasn't just about Rand Paul. It was about a question that had haunted every emergency room, every pharmacy counter, every parent holding a child's empty pill bottle at 2 a.m. What are we worth if our lives can be priced? Jasmine turned that question from a whisper into a weapon, and it cut deep, not through skin, but through illusion. Through the story we tell ourselves about freedom, about fairness, about being the greatest nation on earth. Because here's the human truth no politician dares to say out loud. People aren't dying because we lack the medicine. They're dying because we've accepted a system that asks, can they afford it? Before asking, can we help them? That is not healthcare. That is triage by profit. Jasmine's story cracked that illusion in half. And what poured out wasn't just anger. It was shame. We saw it in the letters. We heard it in the footage. We felt it in the stillness of that hearing room when she asked, who saves the patient when the doctor chooses stocks over survival? And no one had an answer. Because the answer required more than a rebuttal. It required a reckoning. This was more than policy. It was a moral audit. A moment where America had to stand in the mirror and face what it had become. A place where a child's access to cancer treatment depends on zip code. Where a mother with 3 jobs still has to choose between groceries and her medication. Where politicians, backed by millions in pharma cash, speak of freedom while watching people die from treatable diseases. Jasmine didn't just challenge that, she named it. She held it up to the camera and said, look at this. Look at what we've tolerated. And something broke. Because once you've heard a senator scream, I've dedicated my life to medicine, only to be followed by Jasmine's calm, crushing reply, who saves the patient when the doctor chooses stocks over survival? There's no going back to business as usual. That's the power of moral clarity. It doesn't just change minds, it changes standards. People started asking different questions. Not is this bill affordable, but how did it ever get this expensive? Not do we have enough votes, but do we still have a soul? Jasmine reminded us that dignity is not a budget item, that compassion cannot be sold in quarterly earnings. And most of all, she reminded us that silence is not neutrality, it's compliance. Because when a mother dies over a $300 vial of insulin, and a CEO jokes about being sued if prices don't rise, the problem isn't just corruption, it's cultural rot. And Jasmine didn't just expose it, she gave us language to fight it. She showed us that freedom means nothing if the poor can't breathe. That choice means nothing if there's only one option and you can't afford it. She reminded us that every system, legal, political, medical, is only as moral as the people running it. And right now, far too many of those people had become comfortable watching others suffer in silence. Jasmine's legacy won't be measured in votes or headlines. It will be measured in awakenings, in every nurse who now refuses to look away, in every med student who writes, healthcare is a human right, at the top of their notes. In every parent who walks into a pharmacy and thinks, why does it cost this much to stay alive? In every staffer who prints out her quote and tapes it to their wall. We cannot call ourselves free if we let the sick die in silence. True freedom begins when every person has the right to live. That sentence wasn't written for applause. It was written for reckoning. And now we're all part of that reckoning. Because we don't just need better laws. We need better instincts. We need to stop treating compassion like a currency. We need to stop calling human suffering a trade-off. And we need to stop acting like silence is safety. The true cost of silence is written on brown craft paper with the names of the dead. And Jasmine Crockett made sure no one could look away from it again. Her story is a warning, but it's also a call to voters. Stop electing cowards who serve donors instead of patients. A call to doctors. Your oath means nothing if you price your conscience. A call to lawmakers. Every vote you cast on healthcare is a moral act. Own it. A call to citizens. If you want a country that values life, start by valuing the lives of strangers. Because if we can be outraged when a billionaire's yacht gets taxed, but stay quiet when a child dies from lack of insulin, what are we even defending? The real battle Jasmine lit wasn't against one senator. It was against the normalization of cruelty. And the greatest danger now isn't that people forget what happened in that chamber. It's that they remember it and choose to do nothing. So the question lives on. It doesn't belong to her. It belongs to all of us. Who saves the patient when the doctor chooses stocks over survival? And if the answer is no one, then maybe Jasmine wasn't just challenging a system. Maybe she was warning us that we're running out of time to change it. And if we're running out of time to change it, then the time to act is now. This isn't just a headline. It's a crossroads. The next vote you cast, the next bill you read, the next silence you let slide, it all matters. If Jasmine Crockett could stare down power, expose the truth, and shatter decades of political comfort in a single hearing, then what excuse do the rest of us have? We don't need titles. We need courage. This is the moment to decide, are you part of the system that profits from pain or part of the storm that ends it? So start where it hurts. Call your lawmakers. Ask them, would you let your own child go without insulin? If they dodge, replace them. If they lie, expose them. Organize in your communities. Flood local halls, school boards, hospital boards. Print Jasmine's quote and tape it to your mirror. True freedom begins when every person has the right to live. And then live it, speak it, demand it, every day. Because this isn't just a fight for healthcare. It's a fight for the soul of a country that forgot its own people. So raise your voice like it's the last one left. Because if we stay silent now, tomorrow won't belong to the brave. It'll belong to the ones who sold survival for profit. And Jasmine Crockett didn't fight that hard for us to walk away quietly. Neither should you. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.